So the first most important topic to understand about building any sort of custom report in QuickBooks is to be able to identify the difference between the source of the transaction versus the destination or the detail of the transaction. For the time being, refer as the source as summary and as the destination as detail. So in a check, for example, as you see on the screenshot, anything that's on top on the header of the transaction, bank account name, payee, check number, date, amount, address, and memo, that belongs to the source. And anything you see under that contains more of the transaction details, that would be the destination. So the expense account, the individual account of the expense account, the memo of each expense account, the customer job being job costed, and the class being used. So just kind of keep that in mind, because when you build a report, you have to stop and think about, well, am I looking for information that belongs to the source, or am I looking for information that belongs to the destination? So let's dig a little bit deeper. Now, the reason why source and destination, or source and detail, or summary and detail, however you want to see it, is so important to understand is because when we pull any custom report in QuickBooks, there's one filter called the detail level. And this is where we tell QuickBooks, listen, just make it all, which means you can extract data from either the source or the destination, which will look, quote unquote, like an all debits, all credits type of report. If you click summary only, then you're restricting to only see source data. And when we do the example, this is going to make tons of sense. The transaction total, right? No, none of the details. And you may see the word split there. And the word split in a summary of the transaction just means that there's multiple line items dividing on where that other side of the equation is hitting in our financial statements. Now, there's an option called all except summary, and all except summary is going to be only to include the detail, so to exclude the summary. Now, something really, really important to know is that the all except summary only works in accrual basis reports. If you ever try to pull a cash basis report that, the summary only, it doesn't work on the cash basis report. That note actually belongs in the top. So the summary only works in the cash basis report, and the details are, let me just put that under, and the details will not work in an accrual basis report. And we'll explain about that, because in a cash basis pulls only details, where accrual can pull both. Now, additional note, really important, some of the summary information will copy over to the detail or to the destination in whenever the information is lacking. But it will not work vice versa. So none of the detailed information goes into the summary. So just keep that in mind. I know for now, it just seems like a lot of sort of technical jargon. Just keep it in mind. When we do an example, I promise you it's going to make tons of sense. The next slide talks about, depending on the transaction type, you will know what account is being hit, or generally what type of account is being hit on the source or the destination. So for example, a check, the source is always going to be a bank account, and the detail could be an expense account, or actually any account that we use from the chart of accounts. A deposit, the source is always going to be a bank, and the detail is by default undeposited funds, but it could also be any account being used. So that this chart just gives you an example of, what are the default source accounts, and those don't change, but the detail, which for most part, you could change them based on the transaction details. Okay. Now, once we go into the report filters, which is what we're going to do in the example, we are going to go to the filter section, and we're going to choose all the specific filters in which we want to discriminate the report by. So we don't want to see certain information, we have to use the filter for that. If we want to see certain information, we also have to use the filter for that. So the most commonly used filters, which are the ones that I recommend, if you're going to build custom reports, that you memorize and know these like the back of your head, are going to be detail level, date, account, name, class, item, amount, transaction type, page status, posting status, cleared, and memo. I guarantee that if you know at least those, I believe those are like 10, you're going to be able to build 80-90% of the reports that you want just with those. So I know there's a lot of filters out there and it's kind of noisy, but if you just know those, you'll be just fine. Now, once we know and understand the filters that we're doing, we also need to understand the difference between the two type of custom reports we can build. We can build a transaction detail report in which contains line by line, transaction by transaction, and based on the detail level filter, we can choose to only show the summary, only show the details, or both. Now, you have one dimension that you can group the data by, which is that total by option, which allows you to group them. And there's about 10 or 12 different options there that we can group them by, and we'll do an example of that as well. And then when we talk about detail reports specifically, this concept of columns has to do with data fields. So the columns are the data fields inside the transaction. Now, changing topics a little bit, custom summary reports. Now, these are different than detail reports because these do not contain line by line, transaction by transaction. They contain a summarized or a total amount. Okay, so it eventually just adds all the information inside those dimensions. Now, the dimensions, which are the rows and the columns to make sort of like an X and Y axis type of report, can be chosen on the first page, and you have a group of basic fields that you can use for the row and the column. Now, those are limited to a few that QuickBooks gives you. For example, in the column section of a summary report, you get about 25 choices. Okay, that the columns are actually have a lot more choices than rows in QuickBooks. And the reason for that is because in QuickBooks, you can summarize by time frame, day, week, quarter, year, that sort of thing, month, only on the columns. You cannot do it on the rows. So never think of a report that you can build in which the rows are going to contain any sort of time frame. Okay. Now, when it comes to those are columns. When it comes to rows, you get about the same set of choices with the exception of the time frame. So that's the one that just kind of differentiates columns and rows in the summary report, is you can only do time frame in the column section. Now, you cannot have conflicting dimensions. Like, for example, if I'm already using name like customer as a row, I can't use vendors as a column. So I cannot use any related or semi-related fields because that will create a conflict. Now, some of the important report preferences, and we'll also do a couple of examples of this, is you can show and hide the description of the account or the description of the item through the preferences, right? A lot of people get confused about, where do I go in my report filters to show and hide the description? And the answer is it's not part of the filters, it's part of the report preferences. So that's from the edit preferences menu. And then one really important one to know is the default report formatting, which allows you to basically choose the font size, the font color, et cetera, of every report that shows up by default, right? That way you don't have to edit every single one. Okay, so let's jump right into the product. Go ahead and close the company file I'm not using, and let me launch the company file here. And by the way, you're welcome to type any questions in the question section, and then during the next break or so, I'll go over those questions. Okay, so let's jump right into QuickBooks. Let's start by talking about the source destination or source detail concept. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new check. Okay, and then on the check itself, I'm going to go ahead and choose the bank account and the payee. And notice that I created these called source just to make it really easy for you to see. So I got the source bank account, the source payee, I'm going to make this, let's say $100, and I'll date this 11, I'll do this 12/30/2018, so that I can pull it later. Then I'm going to type here on the memo, source memo, and then under class, I'm going to select source class. Again, I created these with the word source to make it really, really easy to see. Now under account, I created an expense account called expense. Let's call it source. I'll just pick a regular expense account. Let me choose here current truck expense, and then we'll do here office supplies. Now I'm going to split these just to show it very easy to see. I'm going to split this and put $75 in one expense category and $25 in a different expense category. Now under memo, I'm going to put here source. I'm going to put here detail memo 1 and then detail memo 2. And then I'm going to also job cost these, and I'm going to create a select the customer here that I also put the word detail to just make it extremely easy for you to see it on the report. So notice that I have a vendor name up here that is different than my customer name. I have a class up here that is different than my class on the destination side. I have two chart of account categories that are obviously different than the source bank account category. And so everything is pretty much different. So let me go ahead and save this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control Y on the keyboard. What Control Y does, it opens up the transaction journal, and we can now actually see the guts of the transaction. So what we see here by default, we have here the transaction date, we have here name, and notice that the first line shows source vendor, which is actually the payee of the check. The memo says source memo. The bank says, the account says source bank, and the class says source class. And then when you go to the second and third line, you see very obvious that under name, you no longer see the vendor's name. Now you see the customer's name. And then on the memo, you don't see the check memo. You see the individual line memo. Same thing for class, same thing for amount. Let's dig a little bit deeper, okay? Let's say, for example, that I only want to see the source. So I'm going to click on the Customize Reports button, and then I'm going to click on Filters, and then I'm going to go down to Detail Level, and that's the filter I was referring to, Detail Level, okay? So in Detail Level, I'm going to select Summary Only, okay? And then I'm going to hit OK. And then you see the report only shows the summary side of the transaction. Now, if I click on Customize Report, Filter, go to Detail Level. Now I'm going to switch it and show all except Summary. And I'll hit OK. Now I get only the details of the transaction. Now, this is extremely crucial because this is pretty much the very first step into understanding what information I'm trying to extract from a report. Okay, so let me go ahead and hit escape. Okay, so I closed everything. Now let's start building a detailed report. So I'm going to go to reports, then I'm going to go to custom reports, then I'm going to go to transaction detail. Okay, so I'm basically building a report from scratch. Then I'm going to go into, I'm just going to hit OK for now just to kind of see what happens. Okay, and that's going to be a report that shows a whole bunch of transactions for a specific time period. But let's say I only want to see invoices. So if I want to filter invoices, I have to go to transaction type. So I'm going to click on Customize Report. And then I'm going to click on Filters. And then I'm going to go down and look for a filter called Transaction Type. Once I select on Transaction Type, on the drop down, which I got a couple choices now, I can click on multiple transaction types and I can just find it through here. So I can find the one that I want and then hit OK. That's one option. Or two, hit the drop down and through the scroll up and down menu that I have, find what I want, which happens to be invoice. Now, the only reason why you want to do multiple is because maybe you want to do invoices and sales receipts, right? That's something that could be done if I want to see both. And we hit OK, and then OK. Now, what ends up happening here is that on this particular time period, there's basically only one invoice. You see right there, invoice 1045. However, this becomes just really confusing because we see a whole bunch of lines, we see a debit, we see a credit, a whole bunch of blanks in there, and we'll talk about defaults in a second, just so we can discuss that. But this becomes confusing to some people because someone maybe just wants to see the summary of the invoice. I'm going to do the whole year. I'm going to do this fiscal year. That way it's just a lot clearer. So as we go down, we see debits, we see credits, we see a whole bunch of information. And most people, when they say, hey, can you show me an invoice report? They don't really ask for the details. So what do I mean by that? If you look at the very first line we have here, this is invoice 1047, totaling 21,000. I'm going to double click on it real quick, which will display the report. And then we see that there's a whole bunch of line items, 650, 780, 845. Let me hit save and close. That's what you essentially see here on the credit side. So if I don't want to see the details, I'm going to go to customize report. I'm going to go into filters. Then I'm going to go into detail level. And then I'm going to click summary only. And then I'm going to hit OK. So that is going to now exclude all of the details of the transaction and only show me the summary. Now, what are some pros and cons to this? Okay, one of the pros is I don't get to see any details. The con is that sales tax will be included in here. Okay, that's actually a kind of a big deal. So if you want to see something that excludes sales tax, you have to use the details. You can't use the overall because in this overall portion, there is no discrimination in terms of whether the items are hitting an income account, an expense account, or a sales tax account. That would all be irrelevant. So in this type of report, we are seeing the source and we're going to see the totality of the invoice, including sales tax if there happens to be some. Now, what about showing or hiding some information? Like, for example, maybe I don't need to see so many columns. So I can actually start getting rid of some of these columns in two ways. One, I can click on the Customize Report button on the top left, and I can manually deselect what I don't want. So let's say, for example, I don't want to see memo. I would just uncheck that and hit OK, and then the memo goes away. Or I can go even faster where I can start just manually collapsing them by selecting them and basically resizing into themselves. Okay, let's say that's it. And let me get rid of type also. Okay, so that will give me date, number, name, debit, credit amount, and balance. Now, for some people, in the case of a filter report like this, debit and credit would be redundant, and then balance is probably just too much information, and I'll just want to see the total in the very bottom. So I can just get rid of balance, and then I'm also going to create a new column, which is called amount. I'm going to click on Customize Report, and then I'm going to search here in the column box. I'm going to search for amount, and then I'm going to go ahead and select that one, and then hit OK. And then I will now can get rid of debit and credit, right? And then that would just show an amount, right? So in this case, it would just be a positive amount just because of the type of report that we're looking at. Now, let's talk about dimensioning the report as well. Now, this report contains sales from multiple customers or multiple jobs. It's possible that I can group them together based on customer jobs. So I can click on total by on the top of the screen, and I can click on customer, and that will basically group my sales by customer. And if I get to do that, or if I do that, then the column for customer becomes redundant because I see it here, but I also see it on the header. So I could also at that point get rid of the customer name as well. And then this really hits on the principle that less is better. In many reports, I'm a an accountant and a consultant myself, and people ask me to build custom reports for them. So one of the things that becomes the single most important thing to a lot of people is make the report have just the exact amount of information that I need. I really don't want anything additional to that, and that's basically a philosophy that I do for reports. Okay, so that's one way to sort of group sales by customer in a summary way, no details, in a detailed report. Now, let me go ahead and collapse this a little bit, and then I'm going to show you in contrast what would be a very similar report in terms of the information being displayed, but in a different type of report. We're going to do now a summary report. So we're going to click on the reports menu, custom reports, and we're going to click on summary. Okay. Then I'm going to select date range. I also do this fiscal year. And then under columns, in this case, I'm going to leave it in total because I really don't want any dimension of the columns. But on the rows, I'm going to put customer. Now I'm going to go up here to filters, and then one of the most important filters in a custom summary report would be my account, like from which account I'm pulling information from. So if I'm looking at just raw sales, like for example, in our detail report, we were looking at summary, so we would essentially looking at potentially just raw sales. I want to go into account, and then instead of having all ordinary income slash expenses, I want to pick just all ordinary income accounts. So again, that's the filter we're going to choose, all ordinary income accounts. And then I'm going to hit OK. Then let me bring this to the right. Let me just put them here next to each other by tiling vertically. So now we see essentially a very similar report. For example, we see we have a customer called detail customer 2 that has an invoice of 8,900. Same thing here. Cruz Albert has 93,000. Same thing here. For example, cottage new construction has 335 on my summary report, but it has 331 on the detail report. There must be something on the detail side, maybe one of the items and such that is not hitting it the exact same way, and that could be causing it. So we could explore it. We could go one by one and figure out which one, if really wanted to do so, we can go down and figure out which one is causing the difference, which I think is this one right here. So you look at this invoice right here, invoice 1046 is a total of 30,150, but on this side, but in the sales report, we probably have right here. So we have this item here called retention. This item really affects my balance sheet. And the issue is that when we pulled this report, let me get out of here again. When we pulled this report, the summary, we strictly told it that we want only income accounts, where on this side, we never gave it the chance to tell it I only want income accounts. I want the summary value of the transaction. So that's kind of like the concept behind building a summary and a detailed report. And you can see that there's some slight contracts. Again, not everybody uses balance sheet accounts in transactions for prepayments or retainers. But if you do, you got to keep those things handy.